The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort, and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons, both of those reasons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when three men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of this system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously, this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles, and also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the 3 of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the 3 of these men? What happened to the 4th man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The 3 men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these 3 men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had 3 men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the 3 men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have 2 more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly where Frank Abagnale Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the two, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abagnale into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abagnale's paperwork. And this gave Abagnale a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards. And with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abagnale who was waiting at the mall. And Abagnale played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once, because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade, and it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell. One of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. but regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshi a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshi wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go, but similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshi over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshi was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did, and it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshi was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshi at his door and let him in and fed Yoshi and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshi explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshi well. Yoshi explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshi went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshi was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshi requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold condition. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshi had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound, there was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshi still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshi was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man, and also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshi still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshi didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mine shaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owns this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi, once again, was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshi Shirotori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshi started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshi was going in the opposite direction. Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshi. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshi could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshi was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshi was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshi is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshi passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that. The richest people from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Jimmy Rain. Jimmy Rain is a 77-year-old billionaire with a net worth of $1.5 billion. What is he known for? Well, he's the founder and CEO of Great Southern Wood Preserving. I guess he's known for popularizing the lumber business by starring the cowboy Yellow Fella in his commercials. Let me know if you've seen this guy. I'm Canadian, so I've never seen the Yellow Fella. And quick fun fact, Jimmy Rain is the only billionaire in Alabama. Alaska. Leonard Hyde. Leonard Hyde is the president of JL Properties, a commercial real estate development company in Anchorage, Alaska. Hyde has a net worth of $400 million and is actually tied for richest person in Alaska with his own business partner, Jonathan Rubini. Rubini is the CEO of JL Properties, and each of them own 50% of JL Properties. The company owns real estate in Anchorage, Florida, and Utah, and in their free time, they like throwing polar bears at poor people. I made that last part up, but it's kind of believable. Arizona. Ernest Garcia II. Ernest Garcia owns Drive Time Automotive, a used car retailer, and he is also the largest shareholder in Carvana, an online used car dealer founded by his own son, Ernest Garcia III. Ernest Garcia II has a net worth of $8 billion. And fun fact, in 1990, he pleaded guilty to bank fraud charges. Really cool stuff. Arkansas. Jim Walton. Jim Walton is the youngest son of Walmart's founder, Sam Walton, and him and his siblings have inherited a total of over $78 billion. Jim sat on Walmart's executive board for over a decade before he gave his seat to his son, and is now the chairman of the family's bank, Everest Bank Group, which has $26 million in assets. I know we're early in the list, but so far he is the first entry in the list who gained his sizable net worth through inheritance. California. Mark Zuckerberg. Zuck has a net worth of over $177 billion and is currently the third richest person in the world. He is the co-founder of Meta, the parent company that owns Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Threads. Mark became the world's youngest self-made billionaire in 2008 at the age of only 23. I want to make a joke, but that's honestly insane. Mark and his wife Priscilla have pledged to give away 99% of their Meta holdings throughout their lifetime. And Mark, if you're watching, I'd gladly take some. Colorado. Philip Anschutz. I would just like to remind you all that these people, although they're way richer than you or I, they still are just like the rest of us. Philip, for example, puts on his pants one leg at a time, and shits just like everyone else. Get it? And shits. Okay, I spent most of my time on that joke, but Philip built his fortune by discovering an oil field in 1979 and by investing in railroads. He also founded AEG, his entertainment company which owns major sports teams, venues, and the Coachella Music Festival. His net worth is over $15 billion. Connecticut. Stephen Cohen. Cohen is a hedge fund manager and a sports team investor. Cohen currently oversees Point72 Asset Management, a firm with over $35 billion in assets under management, and before this ran SAC Capital, one of the world's most successful hedge funds ever. Now, he was forced to shut down SAC Capital after he pleaded guilty to insider trading and ended up paying a total of $1.8 billion in penalties, so those two are probably unrelated, but anyways. Cohen also bought the New York Mets in 2020 for $2.4 billion, the highest sale price ever for an MLB team. And throughout the course of his career, Cohen has given over $1 billion to philanthropic causes, including causes related to veterans and children's health. Delaware. Elizabeth Snyder. Snyder is the first woman on this list, and her parents founded W.L. Gore and Associates in 1958, which is a manufacturing company with over 7,000 patents. Their most profitable invention is Gore-Tex, a waterproof fabric that is extremely popular in outdoor gear. Elizabeth owns 5.5% of the company, which does about $2.5 billion a year in sales. One fun fact is that Gore-Tex was actually invented by accident by Elizabeth's brother, who was trying to stretch Teflon. Oh yeah, and she's worth 800 mil. Florida. Jeff Bezos. CEO and entrepreneur, born in 1964, Jeffrey Bezos, who was at one point the second richest man in the entire world and currently has a net worth of over $200 billion. He founded Amazon in 1994 and currently still owns 9% of the company. And one of his most impressive feats was not the fact that he is a space cowboy billionaire, but the fact that his head is incredibly shiny. Good job, Jeff. Georgia. Dan Cathy. Dan Cathy is the chairman of Chick-fil-A, the fast food franchise founded by his father. He grew up doing odd jobs for his dad's restaurant and eventually became the CEO in 2013. And if you know anything about Chick-fil-A, you would know that they've never had any sort of online controversy. Dan is worth over $10 billion. And today, there's over 2,800 Chick-fil-A locations worldwide. Hawaii. Pierre Omidyar. Pierre founded eBay in 1995 and became a billionaire only 3 years later when it went public in 1998. eBay went on to acquire PayPal in 2002 for $1.5 billion. But that's part of a bigger story we'll get into later. He is personally worth over $6 billion. And from 2005 to 2020, Pierre has gifted at least $10 million worth of eBay shares per year, which is pretty cool. Once again, I'm open to receiving shares. Outside of eBay, Pierre also owns a stake in resorts in California and Mexico and is also developing real estate in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico as well. This dude's pretty boring, so let's keep going. Idaho. Frank Vandersloot. Now, hoes and sleuths aside, Frank is very rich. $3.3 billion rich. How, you may ask? Well, he is the founder and former CEO of Melaleuca Inc., an online seller of nutrition and wellness products. And according to Forbes, which is where a lot of this information is coming from, Melaleuca serves over 1 million customers per month, which is interesting because I've never heard of them and their website looks like poop. Illinois. Lucas Walton. If this name sounds familiar, you're not wrong. Lucas is also a member of the Walton family. Yes, that Walton family. Lucas Walton is the grandson of Walmart's founder, and he inherited his fortune when his father unfortunately passed away in a plane crash. He founded Builders Vision in 2021, which is an impact investing group, whatever that means. And he also chairs the Walton Family Foundation's Environment Program Committee, which sounds like a lot of buzzwords. Lucas is worth $28 billion. Indiana. Carl Cook. Carl Cook is the grandson of Captain Cook, and he inherited Captain Cook's fortune. I just realized his name's Captain Hook, not Captain Cook, so that made no sense, but we're keeping it in. Cook's story isn't as cool as Pirate Treasure. He's actually just the CEO of his parents' medical device company, the Cook Group. This company did $2.4 billion in sales last year. Carl Cook's estimated net worth is over $10 billion. Iowa. Harry Stein. First thing I'll say is that I'm glad this guy doesn't share a last name with this YouTuber, but even if he did, I don't think it would matter considering his net worth is almost $10 billion. Stein is an agricultural pioneer and the founder of Stein Seed, a corn and soybean seed company. This company owns around 800 patents to soybean and corn genetics and is one of the world's largest private seed companies through major licensing deals. And a bit of an inspiring fun fact, Stein is dyslexic and mildly autistic as well. Kansas. Charles Koch. Charles's net worth is almost $60 billion, which makes him richer than the last 5 billionaires combined. Charles is the chairman of Koch Inc., which is America's second largest private company by revenue, and it's held that title since 1967. Koch Inc. has done over $125 billion in revenue from its diversified portfolio of companies including pipelines, chemicals, software, automotive components, and even Dixie cups. Kentucky. Tamara Gustafson. Tamara is the heiress of the public storage empire. She made her billions through her family's self-storage business and as a prize-winning horse breeder, of all things. That's not a joke. Her dad co-founded Public Storage in 1972, and she today owns about 10% of the company. Public Storage operates thousands of locations in the US and in Europe. It's really interesting seeing how many people on this list are actually second-generation billionaires. I think we've only covered a few so far that have actually founded the company that's been generating millions. I guess it makes sense considering how large billions are. It may take a generation or two. Louisiana. Todd Graves. Todd Graves is the founder and CEO of Raising Cane's, a fried chicken fast food chain. I'll be honest, I've never tried it. We don't have them in Canada. But I have seen people drink their sauce out of styrofoam cups, so I'm assuming it's pretty good. Graves actually came up with the idea for the restaurant while in college, and his professor gave him the lowest grade in the entire class, and to pursue the idea, he was unable to get bank financing. So he worked as a boilermaker and salmon fisher to save up money. He launched Raising Cane's in 1996 using his savings, and now the company did $3.7 billion in sales last year alone and has over 800 locations in more than 40 states. Todd's net worth is almost $10 billion. Maine. Susan Alfond. Susan's story is actually really inspiring and something we can all aspire to. Harold Alfond founded the Dexter Shoe Company and sold the business to Warren Buffett in 1993 for $420 million in Berkshire Hathaway stock. When Harold died in 2007, his fortune was inherited by his daughter Susan and her 3 siblings. And Susan got a net worth of over $3 billion through inheritance. Wow. Inspiring. Maryland. Annette Lerner. In 1952, Annette lent her 26-year-old husband $250 to start a business. He went on to take that loan from his wife and turn it into one of the largest real estate development companies in the Washington, D.C. area. Through their wealth, the Lerners also bought the Washington Nationals baseball team, and unfortunately, in 2023, Ted Lerner passed away, leaving all of his fortune to his wife, Annette. Really came full circle. She is now worth over $6 billion. Massachusetts. Abigail Johnson. Abigail is the president and CEO of Fidelity Investments, and she currently owns 28.5% of the company. In 2022, she was named the second most successful woman in finance by American Banker and has been recognized for integrating mobile technology and cryptocurrency into the company's initiatives. Fidelity manages discretionary assets totaling over $5.5 trillion in value. And she's also graduated from Harvard, so this girl rocks. And she's also worth $30 billion. Michigan. Daniel Gilbert. At the age of 22 in 1985, Daniel Gilbert founded what would become Quicken Loans, which later became the largest mortgage lender in the entire US. Gilbert took Quicken Loans public as Rocket Companies in August of 2022 and has since originated $79 billion in mortgages since 2023. He also owns the Cleveland Cavaliers, and he and his companies have invested $5.6 billion to purchase and rehab buildings in downtown Detroit with a plan to create 24,000 jobs, which is cool. Gilbert also co-founded the sneaker platform StockX, which is interesting. I can imagine this guy with a $30 billion net worth and co-founding StockX has a pretty cool shoe collection. Nothing like mine though. Just check these out. Minnesota, Glenn Taylor. In 1975, Taylor purchased Carlson Letter Service, a wedding stationery business he worked for in college. He later transformed it into Taylor Corporation, a print services and communications company, which does over $2 billion a year in sales. Taylor also owns stakes in the NBA team, the Timberwolves, the WNBA team, the Lynx, and the United FC soccer team, but he has since sold his stake in both of the basketball companies. I guess billionaires just love buying sports teams. And his net worth is $2.8 billion, which is honestly kind of broke. Mississippi, Thomas and James Duff. The Duff brothers' father founded Tire Mart in 1973 and sold it in 1998. The brothers bought this company back in 2003 and then later started Duff Capital in 2007. The Duff brothers co-founded and co-owned Duff Capital, a holding company which now does over $5 billion a year in revenue with over 20 businesses. Thomas Duff is worth $3 billion. Once again, not sure how this guy's getting by. Missouri. John Morris. No, not John Morrison, the WWE superstar with the crazy physique. John Morris, the old guy, worth $10 billion. Morris is the founder and CEO of Bass Pro Shops, which I'm assuming you've heard of. It's an outdoor gear chain founded in 1972, and he started it out of the back of his father's liquor store, which is pretty cool. The company now does over $8 billion a year in sales, and Bass Pro Shop also acquired Cabela's for $5 billion in 2016. Montana. Dennis Washington. Dennis is a real old money dude. His wealth comes from owning copper mines, marine transportation, and heavy equipment businesses. But he did start from humble beginnings. He worked for his uncle's construction company and then later took out a $30,000 loan to start his own construction company, which he later turned into Washington Companies, which owns the copper mines and everything I just mentioned. He also invested in his son's company, C-SPAN Corp, which is a shipping container company that now has over 150 shipping containers, which is pretty cool. Dennis is worth $7 billion. I find it funny that this guy's a billionaire from mining copper because you don't have to dig underground for it. You can literally just find it in people's houses for free. Nebraska. Warren Buffett. No, not Warren Buffet. Warren Buffett, the billionaire, with a current net worth of around $133 billion. Buffett is one of the most successful investors ever, gathering his huge fortune through Berkshire Hathaway, his investment company, which owns brands like Geico, Dairy Queen, Duracell, and many others. And although this guy's a billionaire, he's pretty well known for being cheap. I'm pretty sure he still lives in a house that he bought for under $100 grand. In the last interview I saw with him, he drives an old Honda and eats McDonald's every day. So at least some of you can say you have something in common with a billionaire. He's promised to donate over 99% of his wealth, and so far he's given away over $60 billion. Shout out to Warren. Also, he's the 6th richest man in the world at the time of recording this. Nevada. Miriam Adelson. Take a wild guess. I blurted out, what is the richest person in Nevada rich from? Did you guess gambling? Because you're right. Although they weren't doing the gambling, they were profiting from the losses of your gambling, specifically your dad's crippling gambling addiction, which is the reason why you are currently having student loans. Miriam inherited her husband's fortune after he passed away in 2021, and she now owns over 50% of the Las Vegas Sands, a casino company that is valued over $34 billion. She's also bought a majority stake in the Dallas Mavericks from Mark Cuban in 2023, and before becoming a billionaire, she was actually a medical doctor as well, which is pretty cool. She is currently worth $35 billion. New Hampshire. Rick Cohen. Pretty sure this is the second Cohen we've had on this list, so there's that. Most of Cohen's wealth comes from Symbiotic, which is a warehouse automation company that partnered with Walmart to automate all of its distribution centers. He also owns C&S Wholesale Grocers, which is the largest grocery wholesaler in the US, with an annual revenue of over $33 billion. Rick is worth almost $20 billion personally. New Jersey. Rocco Commisso. Commisso is the founder and CEO of Mediacom, the 5th largest cable TV provider in the US. Commisso immigrated to America from Italy in 1962 at the age of 12, and his first job was playing the accordion during the movie theater intermissions. Talk about humble beginnings. New Mexico. Ron Corio. Just gonna give a quick poverty trigger warning because Ron is only worth $1.7 billion. I know. embarrassing. On a serious note, Corio became New Mexico's first ever billionaire through Array Technologies, a solar tracking systems business he founded himself, which is cool to hear because there's been a surprising amount of inheritance on this list. He served as CEO of this company up until 2022 when he resigned right before the company's IPO, which is, to me, questionable. New York. Michael Bloomberg. Besides serving 12 years as New York City's mayor and running an unsuccessful presidential campaign, Michael Bloomberg co-founded Bloomberg LP in 1981, a media company and financial firm that has an estimated yearly revenue of over $13 billion. He's pretty philanthropic too. He gave away $3 billion in 2023 alone and has donated more than $17.4 billion in his lifetime to gun safety, climate change, and education, and a few other causes as well. Nice job, Mike. North Carolina. James Goodnight. This is by far my favorite name on the list. Mr. Goodnight definitely has a ring to it. If any of you want to call me that, feel free. James co-founded his analytical software firm in 1976. The software they developed is used to analyze agricultural data. And right now, the software is used by more than 80,000 organizations around the world. And the company brings in over $3 billion a year. Outside of this, Goodnight and his partner Saul, who is also a billionaire, have co-founded a private school, a country club, and a hotel. North Dakota. Gary Tharzald. Gary's a bit of a G. Look at this picture. This is the real picture on Forbes. Dude put a license plate on his ass. We'll let it slide because he's a billionaire. Although just barely. His net worth is $1.2 billion. But he is North Dakota's only billionaire. In 1982, he purchased his first Super 8 motel. And since then, he has built, owned, and operated over 480 hotels nationwide, which is pretty impressive. I'm sure you've at least seen a Super 8 motel, and if you've been unfortunate enough, you've maybe even slept in one too. Ohio. Les Wexner. Wexner founded L Brands, which is a global retail empire that includes Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, Abercrombie & Fitch, and more. Wexner got his start in 1963 when he used a $5,000 loan to start his own store, The Limited, which sold only shirts and pants. Two fun facts about this guy. One is that he bought Victoria's Secret for only $1 million in 1982 when it was just a small failing chain in San Francisco. And second fun fact, his ex-financial advisor was Jeffrey Epstein. Cool stuff. Who knew the guy selling women's panties would be associated with such weirdos? Oklahoma. Harold Hamm. Another banger of a name. Harold is the founder and chair of Continental Resources, one of the nation's largest independent oil companies. Ham started from humble beginnings, and I'm not even making this up, it says it on Forbes. He got his start picking cotton barefoot as a child and working at a gas station at the age of 16 to help support his family. He started a trucking company that hauled water to and from oil fields, and in 1971, he took it alone to drill his first well. And as you can tell, it went pretty well. So yeah, oil and gas billionaire. Let's keep going. Oregon. Phil Knight. Knight co-founded Nike in 1964 with Bill Bowerman. Although he retired in 2016, Knight and his family still own 20% of Nike, which, if you didn't know, earned $51 billion last year. Knight personally is worth almost $41 billion. Knight and his wife Penny have donated $3.6 billion to charity so far, but he still kind of looks like a supervillain, so yeah. Pennsylvania. Jeffrey Yass. Jeffrey Yass, no joke, got his start as a professional gambler, and I'm just gonna leave it there because I think that says it all. Gambling will make you a billionaire and the richest man in your state. Do it now. And if you want a little bit more info, he owns a trading company now, which is one of the biggest trading companies in the world, whatever, and they own 7% of ByteDance, which is the company that owns TikTok, and he's worth $27 billion. But the most important part is that he's a pro gambler, which means that you can do it too if you start today. I hate the fact I need to do this, but I think I need to explicitly say that I am joking and being sarcastic about the gambling. Most gamblers give up right before they win big, so the chance of you becoming a billionaire is low because you likely don't have what it takes to stick with it. Rhode Island. Jonathan Nelson. Nelson has a net worth of $3.4 billion and founded Providence Equity Partners in 1989, where he was CEO up until January 2021. His firm has invested in over 170 companies, including Hulu, Warner Brothers Media, and the Yankees. South Carolina. Robert Faith. Faith is a real estate billionaire with a net worth of around $5 billion. He founded and is currently CEO and chairman of Greystar, which is a real estate investment company and investment management platform with over $34 billion in assets under development. South Dakota. T. Denny Stanford. Stanford owns First Premier Bank, which is a bank that specializes in offering credit cards to high-risk borrowers. His bank has 17 branches and is one of the largest issuers of MasterCards, many with steep rates and low limits. Predatory credit business aside, he is an active philanthropist, stating that he wants to die broke and saying he'll do this by giving away his credit company. So, kind of a G. Tennessee. Thomas Frist Jr. Thomas is a former Air Force flight surgeon that later went on to found Hospital Corp of America with his father in 1968. The company now owns and operates over 168 hospitals around the world and around 2,400 sites of care in 20 US states and the UK. Frist is worth over $30 billion. Texas. Elon Musk. I don't think this man needs any introduction, as he's not only the richest man in Texas, he's the richest man in the entire world. Elon Musk is the co-founder of 7 different companies, including Tesla, SpaceX, and XAI. Say what you want about the guy, but he is extremely efficient, and the level of success he's been able to create is almost unfathomable. Musk has a net worth of over $200 billion, and is one of the younger billionaires on this list at the young age of only 52 at the time of recording this video. Utah, Gail Miller. I really wanted Gail Lewis to be on this list, but unfortunately, after she retired from Walmart, her net worth fell to second richest in her state. Miller owns the Larry H. Miller Group, which has interests in real estate, healthcare, finance, and entertainment businesses. I find it funny that they say interests. It's like, oh, they're just interested in it. They just have billions of dollars, but it's just an interest. They're not doing it. They're just interested with billions. The Millers initially gained their money by starting with a single Toyota dealership and then growing their dealer group to being the 8th largest in the entire company before selling it for $3.2 billion. They later went on to purchase the Utah Jazz for $22 million in 1986 and sold the team in 2020 for $1.66 billion. Not a bad return. Vermont, John Abel. Abel co-founded medical device company Boston Scientific in 1979. Abel took his company public in 1992 and was listed as a billionaire officially in 1996. It doesn't seem like he's done much since that listing, as his net worth today is only $1.9 billion, but since 2001, he has donated over $130 million to charity, which is pretty cool. Virginia, Jacqueline Mars. Jacqueline is the granddaughter of Mars Incorporated founder Frank C. Mars, and she owns an estimated 1/3 of the iconic candy company. I don't want to give it away, but there may be somebody else who owns another third who may be the richest person in another state, but we'll get into that later. Washington, Bill Gates. Gates does a lot of stuff now, which I don't really want to get into, but he got his start by founding Microsoft, which is now valued in the trillions of dollars. With that being said, he only owns about 1.3% of Microsoft at this point, which is still insane. His current net worth is just over $100 billion. And one of the cooler things about him is this mugshot when he got pulled over for speeding in his brand new Porsche 911. Good choice. West Virginia, Brad Smith. West Virginia seriously needs to get their money up and not their funny up, because their richest person isn't even a billionaire. I know, laughable. His net worth is $900 million, so you're getting close, buddy. Brad Smith has served as the CEO of Inuit Softwares from 2008 to 2018, and then served as chairman up until 2022. Wisconsin, John Menard Jr. Menard Jr. founded Menards, the 3rd largest home improvement chain in the US after Home Depot and Lowe's. The company has over 300 locations and did over $13 billion in 2023. John has a personal net worth of $25 billion, and the junior in his name is actually short for Junior Bacon Cheeseburger. Wyoming, John Mars. I told you he'd come back. Can you guess where his money came from? And can you guess his net worth? Well, it was already on screen, so. John Mars' net worth is $38.5 billion, and his net worth also comes from the Mars family fortune. Congrats, bro. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The richest person from every single state in the United States of America. A lot of billionaires, a lot of old people, a little bit of bank fraud, and a little bit of philanthropy too. What war was like in every time period. War and violence has been a timeless theme throughout human history. And although war never changes, some aspects of war do. Specifically, fighting styles, weapons, motivations, and other stuff like that. So today, let's learn why and how war evolved over time. The Stone Age. Technically, there isn't much evidence for war in the Stone Age. But I mean, come on. Does anyone think that humans who have been committing atrocities against each other for all of recorded history somehow all of a sudden were just peaches because they were cavemen? Like I said in the beginning of the video, war and violence is just part of the human condition. Thus, it's fair to assume that we still had wars before most of recorded history. And yes, that includes amongst cavemen. And I'm not just pulling this out of my cave, man. There's archaeological evidence for this. But first, what generally started wars in the Stone Age? Well, in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric people were thought to be nomadic, so they didn't really settle down and stay in one place. Because of this, there wasn't much of a reason to go to war. Resources weren't really seen as being one tribe or another tribe's possession, because in order to possess a river, for example, you'd have to live there and make sure that nobody else had access to it. However, in the Neolithic era, which is 10,000 BC to 2200 BC, tribes started to settle down into territories, which makes the potential for war breaking out much more probable in this time period. A lot of this remains speculation because there isn't enough evidence, but some of the proposed causes for war in the Stone Age would include disputes over territory, food, water, and even fights over women. I mean, think about it. If your average low IQ Chad is fighting his best friends over some random woman, imagine how an entire group of savage-ass mammoth-hunting cave gooners would behave. One terrible event that is speculated by historians to be caused by war is the Talheim Death Pit, which dates back to around 5000 BC. In this location, archaeologists found a pit filled with 34 bodies that looked like they were massacred. And if you include the outer ditch of the grave, there were 67 skeletons in total, all of which seem to have blunt force weapons used on their skull. In this site, researchers also found something that looks like a flat wooden paddle called a Thames beater. And no, cavemen weren't getting freaky with this thing. They used these glorified bonk sticks to baba booey their enemies into oblivion. Now, researchers have really only two theories about this event. One of them is that one village took over another to inhabit it. Another theory is that there was a small-scale civil war in the village, and just like Squid Game, the losers died. But they didn't just get their organs harvested here. The losers of this Stone Age battle ended up in a giant skeleton hole. And I'm not just talking about someone's freaky granny here. I'm talking about an enormous grave that looks like it was constructed for the Jolly Green Giant. Interestingly, only about 7 females aged 13 to 40 were found in the grave, which suggests that they may have been abducted. Besides the earlier weapons I mentioned, Neolithic fighters used axes and hammers made of wood, stone, and animal bones. Sometimes they even used farm tools that doubled as weapons. Talk about ingenuity. As we saw from the gravesite, Stone Age war was barbaric, brief, and brutal. And historians hypothesized they preferred guerrilla-style warfare, which, I'll be honest, sounds a lot better than doggy-style warfare. These wars likely either took place in resource hotspots like rivers, tribal villages, or luxury caveman real estate, such as a nice cave. If you think Vietnam-era guerrilla warfare is scary, imagine picking berries in a field somewhere around your village, and then out of nowhere, 200 cavemen incoherently yelling Baba Booey, getting ready to spank your sorry ass with a glorified paddle that would make your Bapsha's slipper feel like a down feather pillow. Doesn't sound fun to me. Bronze Age. Now that we're in the Bronze Age, we certainly don't have to worry about a lack of evidence because this era has plenty of warfare to cover. In the Bronze Age, society began to see major civilizations starting to organize for the first time, and many historians view this as the dawn of warfare and conflict. Well, official warfare and conflict. As these societies grew more complex and organized, and especially without thousands of years of experience in trading and international business, when one civilization had resources that the other wanted, most leaders' best idea was just to wage war. What resources, you may ask? Well, to begin with, most of the Minecraft basics. Think land, metals, water, loot, and trade routes. Okay, trade routes aren't really in Minecraft, but you get the point. Anyways, quick tangent here, but most people don't consider the importance of rivers in ancient cities. Like all civilizations, rivers and access to water weren't just a want for a booming economy, they were a requirement. Rivers provided reliable access to scalable trade, drinking water, agriculture, and even seafood. And unlike most resources, you can't just trade a river. Thus, war was a natural consequence. One of the biggest wars that took place in the Bronze Age was the Battle of Kadesh. And by studying it, we can gain some insight into what war was like in this time period. But first, does anybody remember the story of Moses in the Bible? Well, the leader of the Battle of Kadesh was Ramses II, which is the same pharaoh from the story of Exodus in the Bible. Although it has been said this battle took place a couple decades before the time period of Exodus, when the pharaoh was younger and probably still better at fighting. You see, Ramses II wasn't happy with all of Egypt's L's in the past century, as Egypt was losing territory to its neighboring empires. So, like all ancient leaders who considered themselves to be gods, Pharaoh launched a wide-scale campaign to regain Egypt's lost territory to restore it to its former glory. Anyways, the Hittites didn't like this, so they made up their own army to counter the Egyptians heading for their land. This story gets long, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. 2 Hittite spies lied to the Egyptians and told them that their army was far away. And for some reason, the Egyptians totally believed them. The Egyptian army set up camp to chill for a bit. And then, a little while later, the Hittites straight up ambushed them. With no time to prepare, the Egyptians had to improvise with their strategy on the fly. And in a matter of minutes, the Hittite army pretty much broke the Egyptian army into pieces. Now, once the Hittites saw that the army was broken up, they got greedy and started plundering the nearby enemy camps for that sweet Egyptian loot. Now, at this point, I'm guessing Ramses was feeling embarrassed and upset because somehow, against all odds, he escaped from the Hittites surrounding him and reunited with his army. This was probably possible because the Egyptians had lighter and more maneuverable chariots, which gave them a huge competitive advantage in battle over the Hittites' heavy chariots, which probably had the modern-day acceleration equivalent of a Mitsubishi Mirage. Now, I know all of this because Ramses II actually had hundreds of fanboys who sat around all day writing poems about him, like the ancient equivalent of a K-pop stan. Either way though, I respect the rulers in this time period because they actually fought with their army in the battles that they waged, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because no world leaders do that anymore. In the end, it was speculated that nobody really won this battle on either side. Apparently, the war created the world's first peace treaty though, which is pretty cool. If you were fighting a war at this point in history, you'd better hope that you had a good army because without it, you'd probably be killed by a stray arrow in a matter of minutes. Now that we're no longer in the Stone Age, we have a significant upgrade in our weapons. When talking about weapons in this era, keep in mind that the invention of bronze, armor, and the bow and arrow changed warfare strategies significantly. For example, if you were a soldier in an ancient ancient Egyptian war, you had to keep your eyes peeled for bowmen and flying arrows at all times. Warfare at the beginning of the Bronze Age was pretty similar to the end of the Stone Age. But even when they did come around to the invention of metal weapons such as the bronze axe, bronze did not always equal better. For example, for most of this time period, most societies still didn't make arrow tips out of bronze because bronze arrow tips were duller than obsidian and more expensive than bone arrow tips. Furthermore, they didn't want to bother spending money on an arrowhead that would probably end up never found again. And as far as other weapons went, a flint mace or axe blow was just as damaging as a strike from a copper one. Because of these reasons, copper knives and swords still coexisted alongside stone, bludgeons, and arrowheads for a long time in the Bronze Age. Warfare was much more organized and strategic than the Stone Age. Armies would use advanced melee formations such as the phalanx, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder using shields for protection and striking their enemies with spears and swords. I think we need to talk about how cool chariots were at this point. For example, in the Battle of Kadesh, chariots were a relatively new technology, only having been invented a couple centuries into the Bronze Age. Chariots were basically the world's first car, with only 2 horsepower. And just like modern day cars, chariot technology improved over time. For example, at some point in history, the lighter 2-wheel chariot was a new design that made it faster and more maneuverable than the earlier models. Also, keep in mind that chariots were considered the cool vehicle back then, and most normies in battle didn't even get one. In this era, fortified cities became more common, and with that came the dawn of siege warfare, where the enemies of your kingdom would use battering rams and ladders to try to bypass your city's defenses, and you would have probably been instructed to shoot them with bows and arrows or throw hot boiling oil and stones at them while they try to climb their ladders. Battles in the Bronze Age typically took place in plains and open fields. Was this because everyone became more civilized than simply resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics? No. The leaders of the battles probably just wanted to make sure that there was enough room to do victory donuts in their sweet new chariots after winning the fight. The Iron Age. Well, now we're in the Iron Age, and unsurprisingly, just like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is categorized by iron. Historians weren't really creative with making these names. In this time period, war was primarily fought over control of resources, as usual, although the definition of valuable resources changed slightly. You see, at every point up until now, fertile land and water was fought for. But now that most people had learned a thing or two about metal forging, valuable minerals like iron were in high demand. Add to this the fact that various religious sects were doing a not very good job at coexisting. While it isn't agreed upon how legitimate it was as an actual event, one famous war that supposedly took place in this time period and has pretty strong evidence for it happening was the Trojan War, a battle between Greece and Troy from the 12th century BC. This battle allegedly broke out after Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Talk about low, dude. Anyways, war in the Iron Age was categorized by double-edged iron swords, spears with iron tips, and even daggers. They used shields constructed of wood and leather, and metal maces. Ouch. Like the other time periods, they used advanced formations in war, making a turtle shell type shape with soldiers' shields. Defensively, cities were within very guarded walls, which might sound like a good idea until you realize that enemies could lay siege on you at any moment. And without water or food coming in, the odds of survival under siege got lowered every single day. Enemies of your city would even build towers to jump the wall, or tunnel under the wall to get within your kingdom. The Iron Age shared a lot of similarities with the Bronze Age, just with some minor and some major developments. The Medieval Era. In the medieval era, war was waged by monarchs and nobles to gain either political power or to expand their territory. If you've been following along in this video, you've probably noticed a common theme. One of the biggest wars in the medieval period was the Crusades, which in a nutshell were organized by Western European Christians after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. In the Crusades, the primary objective was to stop the expansion of the Muslim states and reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East for Christianity, and recapture previously Christian territories. During the medieval era, weapons advanced a lot. Notable weapons of this time period include longswords, lances, which could be thrown from far away, and the Morning Star, which is not as friendly as it sounds. This was a spiky ball on a chain that was designed for crushing knights' armor. Also, they didn't just have mere bows anymore. They had crossbows, which had a huge range advantage, and could even pierce a knight's plate armor. Trebuchets existed too, but unless you were an idiot who got in the way of the projectile path, or you lived in a city that it was being aimed at, they weren't really something to worry about. You could probably just run to the side of the field, and it wouldn't be able to adjust its aim fast enough. Battles in medieval times were not as chaotic as their depictions in movies and story. As one Redditor pointed out, if you stayed in your crowd, keeping your enemy only in front of you while being surrounded by your friends left, right, and behind, your chances of survival increased heavily. Disciplined and organized shield formations allowed smaller armies to hold off much larger forces than they should have been able to, with coordination and skilled teamwork. Additionally, a small group known as the Charge Cavalry, which consisted of heavily armored knights on armored horses, would break into enemy lines, allowing the rest of the army to seep into the cracks of the battle line in order to divide up the army into smaller groups. Men in most medieval wars throughout history were arranged in the most natural formation, also known as the line formation. The larger the battle is, the more important it was to keep the line together. Shock troops, which were knights with lances, swords, and shields, were intended to break enemy ranks and shatter the infantry. And that is why the battle formation we mentioned earlier were used. Keeping your shields tight to hold the line was the #1 determinant of whether or not you would lose a war. And believe it or not, this was a shock to me, evidence shows that the winners of medieval wars often suffered very minimal casualties. Siege was also an integral part of war at this time, with armies relying heavily on catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Another tactic that was used that we mentioned earlier was cutting off supplies to the castle that was being besieged. In reality though, medieval warfare was rough. Regardless of ideals of chivalry, the wars in the medieval era were just as or more savage than the ones from previous eras. This is because medieval times were still a transitional period to more structured forms of war. Early modern era. In this time period, military conquest was one way in which monarchs and empires looked to acquire new land and further spread their wings. Wars were fought for all the same reasons as the last, as well as fights for political power struggles between emerging dynasties and nation states, as well as the desire for economic trading dominance. Events such as the War of the Spanish Succession comprised one such cause. In this age, there were many skirmishes between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. Additionally, one famous war from this period was the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. The 30-Year War was one of the most catastrophic wars in European history. What started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire was soon enlarged into a border dispute involving some of the greatest powers in Europe. This war brought widespread famine, disease, and depopulation, especially in the German states. In 1648, the war finally ended with a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. What was war like in the early modern era? Well, the introduction and wide usage of gunpowder weapons pretty much defined war in the early modern era. Muskets, cannons, and other firearms completely changed the nature of combat and rendered most medieval techniques, such as cavalry charges, completely useless. Many battles were characterized by vast formations of troops and a strategy known as the pike and shot, where musketeers fired a bunch of shots while pikemen protected them from enemy cavalry. So basically, it was spawn camping. Heavy artillery like cannons were mainly used in sieges because they could easily break through fortified city walls. Sieges were frequent, as many armies sought to take cities and fortresses of the most strategic importance, sometimes leading to long, exhausting standoffs. Like I mentioned, this time period saw the development of gunpowder weapons. The musket replaced both swords and bows as the primary infantry weapon. Cannons were also used in combat because of their ability to reduce fortifications, essentially destroying them from a safe distance. The first musket was the matchlock musket, but over time it was improved into the flintlock musket because flint was far more reliable. Gunpowder not only influenced the weapons, but also the battle styles of this time period. This change led to linear infantry formations where soldiers stood in a relatively long, straight line to have as much firepower from their muskets as possible. Cavalry units were still sometimes used, although the invention of muskets made soldiers way less privy to undergoing these strategies. And unlike the last era, urban warfare became much more frequent, as developed cities rose to political and economic prominence, like Vienna and Paris. Like mentioned previously, during sieges, food supplies would typically run low, and everyone, including soldiers and civilians, had to survive on whatever was available to eat. Thus, many of them resorted to eating rats, horses, and dogs, and in some cases, entire towns starved to death during extended sieges. The modern era and present day. Modern day, here we go. In the modern era, ideological confrontations came at the forefront of wars, especially during the Cold War, where the clash between capitalism and communism led to numerous proxy wars worldwide. New reasons for war and conflict included oil and other energy commodities and the drive for industrial power. Wars in the 19th and 20th centuries had many examples of disputes over nationalism, self-determination, independence movements, the American Civil War, and decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. Additionally, warfare in the 21st century saw the rise of terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies and regional grievances. The biggest war in the modern era, of course, was World War II. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, determined the fate of the modern-day world. This war was driven by expansionist ambitions, especially those from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Thus, it naturally clashed with the polar opposite ideologies of fascism and democracy. This war saw countless major battles reverberating throughout Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And as we all know, it ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the toppling of the fascist regime, which established the United States of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the transitional period into the Cold War. What was war like in the modern era? Modern warfare with today's advanced technologies includes firearms, tanks, aircraft, and missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. Contemporary wars use any number of variations in attack style, sometimes combining traditional military battle structure with guerrilla warfare.
They're in the tree!
And in the modern day, rifles and handguns are standard weapons to every soldier. Howitzers provide long-range firepower, and missiles, both cruise and ballistic, provide precision strikes against enemy targets. The invention of nuclear weapons opened an entirely new scale of destructive capability that changed the tide, context, and rules of war forever. Recently, cyber warfare tools have been added to the game as well, allowing enemy forces to intercept military secrets, gain intel, and even turn electricity off to enemies via EMPs. Additionally, drones have changed the game in modern battles, such as the FPV bombing drones currently being used in the Ukraine war. Besides this, for battles that take place in 2024, for the first time in history, it's pretty much a prerequisite to be fighting on air, land, and sea. Bonus: the future. This is a new one. In any of our time period videos, we have never covered on a hypothetical future, but for this video, I figured, why not try it out? With that being said, we've covered every era of history we know. What about the final era, the future era? Well, although I'm no time traveler, this is just fictional speculation, but in the future, it is possible that physical land and sovereignty will give way to fighting over digital control and power. In dictatorial countries, this would probably include power over free speech and the suppression of controversial information. Besides this, however, wars will be fought for many, many reasons. Because at this point, we've progressed so far that any reason we fought a war in the past will probably happen again. Future reasons for war, however, could also include future resources that we don't even know about yet. I'll leave you with a hypothetical to help paint the picture. Imagine the year is 2200. Nowadays, oil money is a thing of the distant past. Up until this point, the most sought after resource was lithium, but a recent breakthrough in supercapacitors makes them the new perfect storage for energy. They can be charged for a single second, last for weeks to months, and hold unimaginable amounts of power in a tiny amount of volume. Basically like Tony Stark's nuclear reactor. After outstanding research reports were released from the once Ivy League Musk University, Elon Musk's research and innovation-oriented university founded in 2045, regarding this new invention, it was an absolute sensation around the world, and even more consequential than the invention of the light bulb. However, there's only one problem with this new technology. The new supercapacitor technology that everyone wants requires a rare mineral called potentia that is currently only found in a little island known as Mergui, formerly known as Fiji. In an interesting twist of fate, nuclear weapons have become completely obsolete, as long before Iran and Afghanistan gained power to nuclear weaponry in 2036, the United Nations pooled billions of dollars into research and development for nuclear defense weapons. The technology that came from this was able to deactivate any and all ICBMs by sending supersonic counter missiles at a nearly unlimited number of missiles. And by 2080, nearly all countries in the world have a nuclear iron dome of mutually assured protection. Because of this, and paired with the new breakthroughs in technology to counter radiation and EMFs, warfare reverts back to something like the World War II era of war, but still far more futuristic. In this warfare, close-range combat is relevant again, and ingenuity gives nations a competitive advantage. Thus, this new supercapacitor was the new holy grail for super advanced combat weapons. From looking back in history, we can conclude that a futuristic war for resources would be far different from the historical examples we've covered thus far. In fact, war might never get waged in the first place in this example, as advanced geospecific information warfare could be utilized first to either keep it from happening in the first place or brainwash the citizens of Mergui to uprise until their government makes a deal that's in favor of the country that's conducting the brainwashing. This is all a future hypothetical, but I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on it because I think this format could be kind of fun. Serial killers from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Thomas Whisenant. Thomas Warren Whisenant was born and committed his crimes in Alabama. He was born on January 29th, 1947, and was convicted for the murders of 3 women between 1976 and 1977. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered these victims and then mutilated their bodies. Whisenant was arrested in 1977 after being caught in the act of disposing of a victim's body. He was convicted and then sentenced to death in 1978, and despite multiple attempts to appeal this decision, he was executed via lethal injection on May 27th, 2010. Gruesome start to this video, and it doesn't get much better. Also, it's just wild to me that someone could be on death row for 32 years. Moving on. Alaska. Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Iowa, but later moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived a life of crime. Hansen was also known as the Butcher Baker for reasons we'll get into, and this individual was seriously twisted. He was an active serial killer in Alaska from 1972 to 1983, a total of 11 years, and unfortunately in that time assaulted and murdered 17 women, or I should say at least 17 murders and assaults. It is alleged that he has up to 37 kills and up to over 31 assaults as well. One of his methods of killing these women would be abducting them and then releasing them into the wilderness, where he would then hunt them for sport using guns and even hunting knives, which obviously plays in the name of the butcher baker. And the baker part comes from the fact that he actually owned a successful bakery. Hansen was caught after all of these years when one of his victims who got away led police directly to him. Once caught, he confessed and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. This monster died in prison on August 21st, 2014. Arizona, Mark Godot. Mark Godot was born on September 6, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona. Although his time active was only a mere 10 months, the level of terror he was able to bring to the Phoenix metro area was almost unbelievable. Mark Godot, also known as the Baseline Killer, was a serial killer, kidnapper, thief, and assaulter. In this 10-month spree from 2005 to 2006, not only did he commit 9 murders, but has also committed 84 other felony charges. Mark Godot was a seriously bad guy, and in 2006 was sentenced to multiple death sentences, and now he currently awaits execution on death row. According to available data, he was only active as a serial killer and serial assaultist for the 10 months that it claims, although I find it hard to believe that Mark was simply a great dude before this time frame. One reason I believe this is because one of the felonies that he committed, mind you, one of the total 93, is a crime that involves him robbing and assaulting a 12-year-old girl at gunpoint. Scum. Moving on. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons. No, not Gene Simmons, the guy your dad thinks is really cool, the guy that your dad paints his face like, the guy that your dad gets too drunk listening to and hits you. That's Gene Simmons. This is Ronald Gene Simmons. Back on a serious note, Ronald Gene Simmons was a mass murderer who killed 16 people, including 14 family members. Almost as if he was competing with Mark Godot, who committed 9 murders in 10 months, Ronald Gene Simmons committed 16 murders in only 7 days. In Arkansas during December 1987. Ronald G. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Simmons served in the military before moving to Arkansas, and on December 22nd to 28th in 1987, he methodically murdered his family members at his home and then later killed 2 other people and injured 4 more in a nearby town. He was arrested without resistance and was convicted of the murder. Simmons was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on June 25th, 1990. Gene Simmons from the band Kiss wanted to rock and roll all night and party every day. Ronald Gene Simmons from Arkansas wanted to kill people. California. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, is likely one of the most infamous names on this list. Strangely, I have never covered him on the channel, even though I've made numerous videos about serial killers. Ramirez was born on February 29th, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, but moved to California at the age of 22. Ramirez's crimes were heavily influenced by his troubled childhood, and he even had a cousin who taught him military skills that Ramirez ended up later using during his killing spree. That killing spree and honestly crime spree, which also included assaults and burglaries, took place in the greater Los Angeles area from 1984 to 1985. During this time, he committed numerous heinous crimes such as home invasions, murders, and assaults. His crime spree, marked by extreme violence and satanic rituals, created widespread fear throughout the LA area. And fortunately, he was caught on August 31st, 1985, where he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until he died of cancer on June 7th, 2013. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball. Scott Lee Kimball was a former FBI informant who was convicted of murdering at least 4 people between 2003 and 2004 while working with the FBI. Kimball was born on September 21st, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. Kimball was a skilled forager who ran a legitimate business buying and selling organic beef, but primarily used his business as a vessel to enrich himself by passing on bad checks and other forged documents. This is relevant because Kimball would forge documents of his murder victims to make it appear as if they were still alive after they were already dead. Kimball exploited his informant status to evade suspicion and continued his crimes until inconsistencies caught up to him and he was arrested. Not only did he expose flaws in the FBI's informant program, but he was also sentenced to 70 years in prison, where he currently stays today. Oh, and if you're curious who the victims were, it was his uncle, his stepdaughter, and 2 of the girlfriends of inmates. This is almost exactly what I meant when I said that I don't believe someone who was an active serial killer was just a good person before their killing spree. This is a great example of that. Connecticut. Michael Ross. Michael Bruce Ross was born on July 26, 1959 in Connecticut. Ross was also known as the Roadside Strangler and the Eggman, whatever that means. Between 1981 and 1984, he murdered and assaulted 8 young women in New York and Connecticut. According to people that knew him growing up, he exhibited antisocial behavior from a very young age. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in 1987 and was executed via lethal injection in 2005. A fun fact about Michael Ross is that he was the last person to be executed in Connecticut before they abolished capital punishment in 2012. Delaware. Stephen Pennell. Stephen Brian Pennell, also known as the Route 40 Killer, was born on November 22, 1957. Interestingly, Pennell is Delaware's only known serial killer in modern history. Good job, Delaware. But unfortunately, that doesn't make his situation any better. Pennell was convicted of the murder and assault of 2 women and was suspected of 3 others. As the name suggests, he abducted most of his victims on Route 40. Pennell was sentenced to death and executed via lethal injection in 1992, making him the first person executed in Delaware in over 46 years. Florida. Eileen Wuornos. I've actually covered Eileen on the channel before, and her story is really quite interesting. Not only was she a female serial killer, but she was a female sex worker who targeted her male client. From 1989 to 1990, while she was working as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, Eileen killed and robbed 7 of her male clients. When caught, she claimed that she was simply defending herself from assault, but that story didn't quite work. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and convicted of 6 murders and was executed via lethal injection in 2002. Fun fact about Eileen is that there's actually a movie made about her story called Monster, which released in 2003. Georgia. Wayne Williams. Williams, also known as the Atlanta Monster, the Atlanta Boogeyman, and the Atlanta Child Killer, was born on May 27, 1958. Wayne was only ever convicted of 2 murders, those being the murders of 2 adult men. But what's peculiar is the fact that he is heavily suspected of being responsible for the murder of 24 children. From 1979 to 1981, there was a spree of child murders in Atlanta known as the Atlanta Child Murders. I find it quite interesting that there's enough evidence to heavily suspect Wayne of being responsible for a very specific number of these murders, but not enough evidence to convict him. I guess it's fortunate that he was at least convicted of these 2 adult murders, but I'm sure his story would be much different if he was convicted of at least some of the child murders he was suspected of committing. Hawaii. Randall Saito. Randall Saito is admittedly not a serial killer, but he is still a killer. Saito randomly and brutally killed a woman at Ala Moana Center in 1979, and since then has been spending time in a mental institution as he was acquitted of this murder due to insanity. That's upsetting and scary. What else is scary is the fact that he escaped the mental hospital in 2017. He walked out of the facility, took a taxi to the airport, and flew to California using a fake name. Fortunately, Saito was caught days later and was charged an additional 5 years for the escape, but his escape definitely raised questions about the security lapses at the hospital. Like, I know Hawaii is laid back and chill, but it boggles my mind that in 2017, not 1987, in 2017, he just walked out, took a taxi, and took a flight with a fake name. Wild. Idaho. Paul Ezra Rhodes. Paul is one of your more or less cookie-cutter serial killers. He went on a killing spree, killed young women, was convicted of some of the murders, was suspected of more, and was executed via lethal injection. Like everyone on this list, this dude was horrible and disgusting. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. If you're the type of person to be watching this video, then you're probably the type of person who knows who John Wayne Gacy is. He is one of the most infamous American serial killers and is widely known for his assault, torture, and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy's story is long and well documented, and I will only be giving a brief overview in this video, but if you're interested, there's a lot of documentaries. Gacy famously lived a double life, as he was seen as a pillar of the community by throwing events for the neighborhood. He was a manager at KFC and then started a construction business after spending some time in jail. Gacy was known as the Killer Clown because during his community events, he would typically dress up as a clown to entertain his neighbors. Although, unfortunately, for some of his victims, he would also dress up as the clown and assault and murder them. Gacy's story is extremely disturbing and was ultimately caught when bodies were discovered underneath his floor in his basement. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. He was then sentenced to death in 1980 and executed via, you guessed it, lethal injection in 1994. If a clown ever asks you if you want to try getting out of handcuffs, don't do it. Indiana. Herb Baumeister. Baumeister is a serial killer from Indiana and was active from the 1980s to the 1990s. He is suspected to have murdered at least 11 men and possibly all the way up to over 25 men. Due to the fact that there was no trial, this is all suspected, which is something we'll get into, but it's pretty certain. Why I say that is because human remains were found on Baumeister's property. Not only were the remains of 11 men found on the property, but there was also over 10,000 bone fragments scattered across the grounds of his farm. It is believed that Baumeister would lure victims into his home, specifically gay men, where he would then assault them and then kill them before burying their bodies. Once the police caught on and began looking for Baumeister, he had already escaped to Canada, where he took his own life in a national park before police could ever catch up to him. And for that reason, he was never convicted and never sentenced. But I think he knew what he had coming. Iowa. Earl Nelson. Earl Nelson is one of the oldest entries on this list so far, being born on May 12th, 1897 in California. Earl Nelson was also known as the Gorilla Man or the Dark Strangler. He was a serial killer, a assaultist, and a necrophile, and was also considered to be the first known serial assault murderer in the 20th century. He committed over 22 murders and also 22 separate attacks all across the west coast of the United States, including primarily Iowa. Nelson targeted landladies and their daughters and would gain entry to their homes by posing as a prospective tenant. He would then strangle the victims and do extremely unspeakable things. Nelson was caught in Canada, of all places, in 1927 and was executed by hanging, not lethal injection. So there you go, something new. Kansas. Dennis Rader. Okay, so this guy is wild. Everybody on this list is a complete lunatic, but this one in particular, I just finished watching a documentary about him. He was known as the BTK killer, which is actually an acronym for his routine, I guess you could say. He would bind, torture, and then kill his victims. And that's how he referred to himself as well. He was active in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 until 1991, a huge gap. What's even crazier is that he wasn't even caught until 2005 when he was arrested and pled guilty to all of the murders. What's potentially even crazier than his time active as a killer, or the large gap after his active period where he was just still free, is the fact that he would also, during his time active, would taunt the media outlets and police by leaving detailed messages describing his crimes. The only reason he was ever even caught is because in 2004, after a 13-year hiatus, he decided it was a good time to start rewriting letters and begin taunting the police again, when at this point, technology was advanced and they weren't playing around, and they caught him shortly after in the following year, and he was arrested, like I mentioned, in 2005. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kentucky. Donald Harvey. This monster is a little bit different than some of the other monsters on this list. Harvey was a killer who claimed to have 87 murders, but was only confirmed to have 37. Still a ludicrous amount. He was active in Ohio, Kentucky between 1970 and 1987, a 17-year span. He gave himself the name the Angel of Death, and it'll all make sense in a second. Harvey was a healthcare worker and said that he started killing his patients to simply put them out of their misery, but said he eventually grew to enjoy killing his patients. Harvey would typically kill his victims by poisoning them with cyanide or suffocating them with a pillow. How Harvey was caught after doing this for so long, 17 years, is because the last victim he ever killed was a man who was on life support for several months after a motorcycle accident. His autopsy revealed the large amount of cyanide in his system, and then people began to grow suspicious, specifically of Harvey. They became extremely suspicious of him when they learned that he was forced to reside from a previous job in a Cincinnati hospital when he was caught stealing body parts for an occult ritual. Wild that he was even able to continue working in healthcare at all. Harvey lived in prison from 1987 all the way up until 2017 when he was found in his cell severely beaten and then later succumbed to his injuries and died in prison. It's crazy to me that someone working in healthcare with a very strange and peculiar history is able to kill at least 37 people over 17 years and not get caught for so long. We're not even halfway done this video yet, and we've heard some disgusting and deplorable stories, and I'm sorry to inform you, it doesn't get much better. So I did want to take just a quick breather before we got back into it. Okay, if you currently make YouTube videos, I want you to watch this. And if you don't, just skip to this timestamp. I get a ton of questions about how I make my videos, what I use to animate, what I use to illustrate, how I grew on YouTube, and everything of the sort. And my friend, Internet Anarchist, also had a lot of similar questions as well too. Him and I both had very fortunate experiences growing on YouTube, and it wasn't an accident or luck at all. It's my belief that success is caused by three things, not just on YouTube, but in anything. knowledge, experience, and immersion. Knowledge meaning having the right knowledge to know what to do and where to go. Experience meaning actually putting that knowledge into practice, testing it out, and learning for yourself with the proper guidance to avoid major mistakes. And immersion. Immersion meaning being surrounded by like-minded individuals that are on the same path as you, that you can compare notes with and relate to. A big problem that we've noticed in the YouTube community right now is there is a lot of people trying to sell information to brand new YouTubers who don't have a budget and don't even know any better. So they'll fall for every trick in the book, and it's extremely disheartening. Internet Anarchist and I both realized that there was something that we could do, and we did it. That's why for any of my subscribers who have a YouTube channel that are wanting to actually grow and take YouTube seriously, I would love to invite you to our new school community called 1 of 10 Community. This is a completely free community. It's always free and will forever be free. It currently includes myself, Internet Anarchist, other huge YouTubers, and over 1,400 other small creators that are looking to grow their channel and are working every day to get better and providing each other feedback and support. My goal with this group is to provide small and upcoming YouTubers the absolute best opportunity to be able to grow quickly in a way that's not a scam. Like I said, there's a lot of predators on YouTube, and not that kind of predator, that are looking to prey upon small YouTubers who have the dream of growing but don't have the knowledge of making it happen. And unfortunately, these people are typically easily fooled by fake plaques and fake screenshots, and they are sold expensive courses that don't help them. That's why me and Internet Anarchist made something that was better than these paid courses, and it's absolutely free. So before we get back into the killing spree, if you are a YouTuber that follows me and you want to grow more on YouTube, please, I would love you to join 1 of 10 Community. The link's in the description. It's a completely free school community. Make an account and join a network of a ton of YouTubers like yourself who are just trying to grow and make their dreams come true. Okay, back into the void. Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee. Lee was born on November 5th, 1968, and was from St. Francisville in Louisiana. He is also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer and is known for his killing spree from 1998 all the way up to 2003, where during this time, he terrorized Baton Rouge and surrounding areas by committing at least 7 murders of, you guessed it, women. Before his murders, he was a great guy, right? No, not at all. Before his murder charges, Lee was actually arrested for stalking women and watching them in their own home. In an interesting twist, despite this previous arrest, during the search for this serial killer, the police overlooked him because they assumed the serial killer was white. However, Lee was eventually linked to all of these murders of these women in Louisiana via DNA tests, and in 2004, he was put on trial and was sentenced to death. Lee did not end up being killed via lethal injection because he actually died of heart disease in the hospital while on death row at the ripe old age of 47. Maine. James Hicks. Hicks is the only known serial killer from the state of Maine, and information on him was not easy to find. But the long and short of the story is, in 1977, his wife magically disappeared, which caused suspicion, but not that much suspicion because Hicks was not arrested until 1983 and convicted a year later in 1984. Before this arrest, another woman went missing who was last seen at a bar with Hicks. He was never arrested for this disappearance because there was never enough evidence to connect him to it. But after he was suspected of his wife's disappearance 6 years later, they tied the two together. For both of these disappearances, he was only sentenced to 10 years and only served 6 of them and was released from prison in 1990. Once he was released, he met another woman, started a life with her, moved in with her, and 6 years later, murdered her. He was suspected in her disappearance, but Hicks was never charged with her death either because of a lack of evidence. This guy was slimy. The only reason that Hicks was caught is because he was in Texas holding a gun to a 67-year-old woman's head, forcing her to sign over the title of her car to him and then write a note you would write to your loved ones telling them you won't be around, if you get my drift. He planned to drug and drown the woman to make it look like she did it, but this woman somehow escaped and Hicks was caught for this act, sentenced to 55 years, and during this time confessed to the 3 other murders he committed and actually led the Maine authorities directly to the sites where he buried these bodies. But yeah, Maine's only serial killer was a disgusting guy who got way too lucky for way too long. Maryland. Joe Matheny. Matheny is a hilarious name, specifically for this dude, because he looks like he enjoys meth-eny. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and claimed to have killed 13 people, but was only ever convicted of 2 of these murders. Research later confirmed 3 additional victims through matching his confessions to evidence. So he was convicted of 2, confirmed 5, and claims up to 13. He specifically preyed on homeless men and prostitutes, luring them in with the promise of food and drugs, and actually would just give them death. Notably, Matheny dismembered some of his victims and even disposed of their remains at a meat stand where he worked. He was arrested in 1996, convicted of multiple murders, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. So that's him. Massachusetts. Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler, I think the third or fourth strangler on this list so far, is a serial killer who confessed to the murder of at least 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. DeSalvo would gain entry to his victims' homes by posing as a handyman. He, not shockingly, would strangle his victims to death. Very interestingly, DeSalvo was never convicted for any of these murders, but was imprisoned for other crimes. In 1973, in prison, he was actually murdered due to an ongoing debate that had taken place in the prison about his involvement with the Boston Strangler cases. So you could say justice was served, but not in the traditional sense. Michigan. Carl Eugene Watts. Watts was born in 1953 in Texas and might have the highest kill count on this list so far. Not that that's an accomplishment at all. It is just a morbid fact. Watts was nicknamed Coral and was dubbed by media outlets the Sunday morning slasher, who murdered an insane amount of women over an 8-year period. He is also suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in all United States history. At the absolute minimum, Watts is responsible for 14 murders, but at the absolute most, he is responsible for over 100 murders. Keep in mind, this was only through an 8-year period. Wild. All of which of these murders took place within Michigan. Watts would stalk his victims, break into their homes, and then kill them using various methods, such as stabbing or strangulation. Watts was arrested in 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 2007. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 3, you guessed it, women in Minnesota during the early 1980s. He gained his nickname from his tendency to call emergency services after committing his crimes in a sobbing, high-pitched voice. Stefani was caught in 1982 after 2 years of being active and later confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 40 years of prison and, like some others on this list, died of cancer in prison. Mississippi. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn lived a very transient lifestyle and for that reason killed in many different states and lived in many different states. But for the purpose of this video, we're focusing on Mississippi. Glenn is convicted of 2 murders, suspected of 3 more, and claims over 70 total. Glenn was active from 1993 to 1995. And during that time, he worked as a handyman and also, you guessed it, killed women. You can probably guess how as well. Something interesting about this guy though is the fact that he actually was on the FBI top 10 most wanted fugitives list and was caught after a nationwide manhunt. Currently, he's on death row in Florida. Missouri. Robert Burdella. Burdella was a serial killer from Kansas City who was known as the Kansas City Butcher, or more ominously, the Collector. He was active during the 1980s, and during this time, he killed at least 6 young men. Yeah, different. He would lure his victims, who were often young men, into his home where he would subject them to prolonged periods of captivity and torture, typically including assault, and always ended in murder. After being active for 3 years, Burdella was caught in 1988 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He ended up dying in jail 4 years later in 1992 at the age of 43. Montana. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This case specifically is quite upsetting and disturbing. Jonah was primarily a child assaulter and was only a suspected serial killer and cannibal. And although he has 0 confirmed murders, he has 5 suspected murders and 10 plus confirmed victims that are children that survived. He was active from 1964 all the way until 1999, which is just heartbreaking. At least in 1999, he was apprehended and convicted with assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and child assaultation, and was given 130 years in prison at the Montana State Prison, where he died in 2008. Gross. Nebraska. Charles Starkweather. This case has one of the fastest timelines on this list. Starkweather was a serial killer who, along with his girlfriend, killed 11 people in the span of only 2 months. The rampage began with the murder of a gas station attendant, and this snowballed into a series of robberies and killings, including the murder of some of his girlfriend's family members. After this 2-month killing spree, the pair was caught in Wyoming after a high-speed chase. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed a year later after being caught in 1959. So let me break it down for you. This guy was 18 years old, decides to go on a 2-month killing spree, and is executed via the electric chair only 6 months after being put on death row. He died at the age of 20. That is quick justice. His girlfriend, on the other hand, who was his accomplice, was only sentenced to 17 years in jail. Wild. Nevada. Carol Cole. This is the first man I've ever seen named Carol, so that's something. Cole was a serial killer who was convicted of strangling 2 women in Nevada and murdering 3 others in Texas. This is pretty typical. What's not as typical is that he is believed to be linked to at least 30 other murders between 1947 and 1980. A huge 33-year gap of being an active potential killer. Wild. Cole was sentenced to death for his crimes, and for his last meal he had jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, and salad with French dressing and Boston clam chowder. And the next day he was executed via lethal injection on December 6th, 1985. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBerre. In 2008, Sheila was convicted for murdering 2 of her boyfriends in 2005 and 2006, respectively. And she claims that she did this because she was sent by God as an avenging angel to Earth to punish pedophiles, which in her mind included her 2 boyfriends, whose bodies were found on her huge farm. Now you might be like, all right, I can get behind this a bit, I get it. Here's another twist. According to Brad Bailey, a defense attorney who represented her, he says, and I quote, "There seemed to be no basis whatsoever in reality to suggest or claim any of her victims were pedophiles or engaged in any of these child abusing behaviors. None whatsoever." So yeah, not only does she murder people, but she also tried to ruin their name. Sheila typically met her victims by putting out personal ads looking for farmhands on her farm. Although she was only convicted of the murder of 2 men, she also admitted during her trial that she killed several others, but these were not confirmed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. New Jersey. Richard Biegenwald. Biegenwald was active from 1958 all the way till 1983, and during this time, you guessed it, he murdered people. In 1983, he was convicted of 5 murders but was suspected of 8. An interesting fact is, after the serial killer died, his lawyer actually mentioned publicly that this criminal told his lawyer that he may have up to 100 victims, which is likely inflated, but the fact is this monster likely had many more victims than he was convicted for, which doesn't seem extremely uncommon for this list. Richard was actually on death row for a short amount of time, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison, where he still died in prison in 2008. New Mexico. David Parker Ray. Ray was a suspected torturer who is also known as the Toy Box Killer. This case is really interesting because he technically has 0 murders confirmed, but has 3 confirmed victims and possibly anywhere from 60 to 100 plus victims that he tortured and assaulted on his property in his toy box, which was basically a trailer beside his home, which is a movable, portable torture chamber that he had a large kidnapping and assault operation happening in there. Crazy. For the unthinkable amount of torture that he inflicted upon potentially hundreds of women, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, where he unfortunately only served a few months because he died of a heart attack. Unfortunate he didn't serve more time. Not unfortunate that he died. Ray was a serious monster and is even quoted saying that he did nothing wrong to women. He only did what women wanted, and he got pleasure from their pleasure. And his assault on these women was, in his mind, him doing good for society. So he thought it'd be total sicko. New York. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam or Mr. Monster, according to Wikipedia, was a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz, surprise, surprise, targeted young women and couples, shooting them in cold blood with a .44 caliber revolver. His crimes sparked a citywide manhunt for him, and he even left notes taunting the police, promising more crimes. Fortunately, Berkowitz was caught in 1977 and later confessed to all of his crimes, which were plentiful. He ended up murdering 6 people and wounding 11 more. He is currently in jail serving 6 life sentences as we speak. North Carolina. Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace may have one of the most odd nicknames on this list. He is known as the Charlotte Strangler, which is somewhat tame, but he's also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. This video is not a laughing matter, but that name is weird. I guess it's because he worked as a manager at Taco Bell in Charlotte. Wallace was a serial assaulter and murderer, targeting young African-American women, and over the course of a 4-year span, he victimized over 9 women. He was caught in March of 1994 and currently sits on death row awaiting execution. North Dakota. Eugene Butler. The story of Butler is unlike anything we've heard on this list so far. He is the only killer who was never convicted of his crimes so far on this list. Eugene Butler was born in 1849 in New York State, but all of his crimes took place and he actually died in North Dakota. But we'll get into that. From the years of 1900 to 1906 in Niagara, North Dakota, Butler murdered 6 teenage boys in his house and buried the bodies in his basement. Now, the twist of all this, Butler was actually committed to an insane asylum for unrelated charges where he died in 1913. The crazy part is the bodies that were buried in his house were not found until 1915, 2 years after Butler died in the insane asylum. Super weird. Ohio. Anthony Sewell. The story of Sewell is something we've heard numerous times on this list so far, so I'll keep it brief. He had a generic name. He was known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was active for 2 years, from 2007 till 2009. He murdered at least 11 women who he targeted, specifically women that were vulnerable. By that I mean women that were either dealing with addiction or homeless. And he was arrested in 2009 when one of his victims escaped and alerted authorities. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death in 2011. Sewell died in 2021 due to an unspecified terminal illness. Oklahoma. Roger Dale Stafford. Stafford was a serial killer active from 1974 until 1978, and in this time he had 9 confirmed kills, which he was evicted of, but potentially a lot more. Stafford started his killing spree by killing an assistant manager working at a McDonald's. After killing this manager, he robbed the McDonald's for over $1,300 and then continued on his spree. His next targets were a family that he flagged off the side of the highway, who he robbed and murdered the entire family. 3 weeks later, he robbed a sirloin stockade in Oklahoma City, and during this robbery, murdered 6 employees, most of these victims being teenage staff members. 6 days after this restaurant massacre, Stafford was found and apprehended. Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to death, and in 1995, he was executed via lethal injection. Oregon. Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dubbed the Molalla Forest Murderer due to the fact that he would dump the bodies of his victims in the Molalla Forest in Oregon. Rogers was a serial killer who was active for, once again, 4 years and targeted, once again, vulnerable women, specifically addicts, sex workers, and the like. Rogers notably was sentenced to death 4 times, with each sentence being overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. And in 2021, his death sentence was overturned again due to new laws, and in 2022, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik. Gary was a serial kidnapper, torturer, and murderer, and fortunately was only active for just over a year. During this year, he kidnapped 6 women, 2 of which died from his torture, and the other 4 fortunately survived. One of these surviving victims was actually able to go to the authorities and inform them about Gary's horrendous actions. Gary was quickly arrested in March 1987 and convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, aggravated assault, and more. He was sentenced to death, and in 1999, he was executed via lethal injection and was one of the last people to ever be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island. Craig Price. I believe Price is the youngest killer we've seen on this list, with his first murders taking place when he was only 13 years old. From the ages of 13 to 15, he committed 4 murders of women in his neighborhood, and he was arrested at the age of 15. Due to his age, he was actually initially set for release at the age of 21, which to me is mind-boggling for someone who murdered 4 people, no matter their age. But due to ongoing violent behavior within prison, he was sentenced to a much longer time and actually tried as an adult. He will likely never see the light of day. South Carolina. Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins was born in 1933 and unfortunately had a huge span of crimes in his lifetime, starting in 1953 and going all the way until 1982. During this time, he had 15 confirmed kills and later on claimed he had up to 110. He killed hitchhikers, acquaintances, and more, and had a laundry list of charges under his belt. A couple notable things about Gaskins is the fact that when he was arrested, he was actually sentenced to death, but then was later commuted to only life in prison, but then later killed someone in prison using a bomb, and because of that was once again sentenced to death and later executed in prison in 1991. Dude literally got off death row and got right back on with a bomb somehow. Crazy. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson. Anderson was your run-of-the-mill creep. He was an assaulter and killer. He has at least 2 confirmed victims across multiple states in the US, primarily South Dakota, and would typically lure victims by posing as a photographer wanting to take pictures of people. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, and in 2002 died in prison while waiting for execution. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed. Reed was also known as the fast food killer, specifically because he targeted fast food workers working the late shift. He would rob, assault, and murder these employees, and was sentenced to death for the murder of 7 fast food employees in the Nashville metropolitan area. Reed was sentenced to death and died in 2013 while waiting for execution. Fast food employees really deal with too much. Texas. Dean Corll. Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, was a mass serial killer, serial assaulter, and serial torturer, and was a member of the Houston mass murders, which at the time of its discovery were considered the worst example of serial murders in the entire history of the US. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family had previously owned and operated a candy company in Houston, and he personally had been known to give free candy to local children, which is the most stereotypical and scary thing I've ever heard. and he was known as the Pied Piper because his murders would typically start with him luring people, typically with the offer of a ride or for an invite to a party. From the years of 1970 to 1973, Coral and his 2 accomplices murdered at the very least 28 victims. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much time Coral got because he was never sentenced. He was actually murdered by one of his accomplices before he was ever caught, which may be good or bad news depending on how you look at it. After this accomplice killed Coral, they called the police and promptly confessed to all of the murders, leading to the discovery that shocked Houston to its core: Utah. Ted Bundy. If you're watching this video, you definitely know who Ted Bundy is, and I probably don't need to tell his story. But as a quick recap, he has an unknown amount of victims, but it's likely believed to be in the range of 30 to 36. He was active during the 1970s and was executed in 1989. If you want more details, watch this video. I go in extreme depth about his story. He is a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover. Vermont. Israel Keyes. Keyes is a very strange serial killer. He was extremely meticulous in his planning, but extremely random in his selection of victims. He murdered at least 11 people across multiple states, including Vermont, between 2001 and 2012. And Keyes even had a specific method of burying what he called kill kits in different locations so he could commit murder at any time. He was captured in 2012 and didn't continue living, I'm not going to say unalive because that's the dumbest thing ever, while awaiting trial, leaving so many questions unanswered about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. Virginia. Timothy Wilson Spencer. Spencer was active from 1994 to 1998, once again, 4 years, committed 5 assaults and murders, and was sentenced to death by electric chair, not lethal injection. Washington. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was active from 1982 to 1988, confirmed, and was possibly active as recent as 2001. He was arrested on November 30th in 2001 and confessed to murdering at least 71 women, many of whom were vulnerable women, like we explained before. This unfathomable kill count made him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. In 2001, he pled guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty and is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It's crazy how someone with 71 murders can actually avoid the death sentence. Whether you're for it or against it, it's crazy how somebody with 2 murders can get the death penalty, but someone with 48 confirmed at the very least can get around it. West Virginia. Harry Powers. Powers was an active killer in the 1930s and was particularly evil because he preyed upon vulnerable, lonely widows who had just lost a loved one. He would meet them on classified ads in the newspaper and would murder them for their money. During his time active, he killed at least 5 women and 3 children before being caught. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1932. Once his story gained national attention, it was considered to be a contributing factor to people's fear of meeting people through classified ads in the newspaper. Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Much like Ted Bundy, this demented monster likely needs no introduction. His story has been told many times, and his infamy is widespread. If you want an in-depth review, here's a video where I discuss his story at length. In short, he murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He primarily targeted black young men, luring them into his home with the promises of sex or money. He did unspeakable things to his victims' bodies and was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but was only killed a few years later in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton. Eaton was a suspect in a string of murders known as the Great Basin Murders, which took place from 1983 to 1997, where over 9 victims, most of them being teenage females, were assaulted and killed. Eaton was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison. And ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. One serial killer from every single state. There was honestly a surprising amount of similarities across the board. Notably, at least to me, were the fact that a lot of these murderers were able to get away for 4 years. That was a pretty common trend. And every killer has some weird nickname, like the something strangler, which is the most common. It's like being a rapper and having Lil in your name. And a very unfortunate and upsetting trend is that almost every serial killer was also a serial assaultist, except for one guy. One guy, or maybe 2 of these guys, was a robber that murdered people. Not necessarily much better, but the scariest SCPs from around the internet. If you're watching this video, you probably have some sort of context of what an SCP is, and maybe you're even an expert. But if you're anything like me, you've probably heard the term SCP online before, but you didn't quite understand what it meant or what it was. I always kind of knew it was some sort of scary online creature, but that's where my understanding kind of ended. But because you guys are so awesome and always give me video ideas in the comments, I have seen SCP brought up in my comments quite a bit, so I knew it was time to do some research. In case you have no idea what an SCP SCP is, let me give you the basic gist. The SCP Foundation is a collaborative writing platform centered around the fictional Foundation, a scientific and military organization that seeks to protect humanity and the status quo by locating and containing anomalies, objects, life forms, events, locations, concepts, creations, and phenomena that are in one way or another not natural. I know it sounds confusing, but these are basically just online mythical creatures that people made up that don't exist, and it's just funny and creative writing, basically. So with all of that being said, let's begin. Here is a list of some of the scariest ones that I've seen so far. Starting off, we have SCP-354, also known as the Red Pool. As the name suggests, SCP-354 is a red pool of a blood-like substance, but it's not blood. This pool is hidden in northern Canada in Area 354. And the most dangerous thing about this liquid is the fact that every so often, a very hostile and dangerous creature just emerges out of it. Due to the fact that this SCP isn't a creature, it's literally a body of water. It is actually not contained within the Foundation, hence the construction and existence of the fortified area built around this specific SCP. A few other things to mention about the pool that are kind of interesting are the fact that the water gets denser the deeper you go in the pool, so there isn't any information about how deep the pool is because no one's been able to get that deep, and also every hostile creature that's emerged out of the pool has been neutralized. This SCP is definitely scary and definitely creepy, but it's nothing compared to what else is on this list, so let's keep going. Next up, we have SCP-966, also known as the Sleep Killer. This SCP stands at 1.4 to 1.6 meters tall and weighs only 30 kilograms. It is a hairless humanoid creature that has a very gaunt and elongated face with razor-sharp, needle-like teeth. This creature also has 5 razor-sharp claws on each hand. These claws aren't usable for combat as they are very weak and brittle, as is most of the creature. Its bones are hollow and it has very little muscle. And for that reason, this creature is not a big risk for physical attacks. So with that being said, why is it so scary? Obviously it looks scary, but is there any danger? Well, yes. This creature possesses 2 very unique abilities that makes it so dangerous. The first ability or attribute about this creature is the fact that it is only visible by infrared light, meaning that to the naked eye you cannot see these creatures. And the only way that you can see these creatures with a human naked eye is by burning them. Their tissue and organs become visible to the human eye once they are exposed to 3rd and 4th degree burns. That's more of an interesting attribute, but one of the most dangerous attributes about this creature is their unique ability to cause sleep deprivation. SCP-966 has the ability to yell and produce a never-before-seen ultrasonic wave that causes sleep deprivation and the inability to sleep in its victim. No matter what the victim does, it will not be able to sleep and eventually will die of sleep deprivation. At that point, the deceased victim will be consumed by SCP-966 and the cycle begins again. I don't know about you guys, but for me, this SCP has all the ingredients for nightmare fuel. But like I said previously, we're just getting started. Third on our list is SCP-280, also known as Eyes in the Dark. SCP-280 is a black, wraith-like apparition that floats only a few centimeters above the ground and stands or floats at average human height. This ghost-like creature has no visible legs or feet, and the lower part of its body simply fades away into nothing. Oh, yeah, and it also has super long, creepy fingers. This creature in its dormant state basically resembles a shadow and hides in dark corners or around objects while it waits for humans to pass it by. And why it's able to do this is because of one of its very unique abilities, which is able to essentially shift states of matter going from physical to almost like a vapor-like form at will. This creature is extremely strong and extremely aggressive to people, with death being its primary goal. One of the only ways to deter this SCP is with light. And when light is put directly onto this creature, it displays 2 large white eyes on its head, which, according to tests done by the Foundation, are purely aesthetic and have no function, similar to some insects that have eye-like patterns on their wings or body. These eyes are not visible when they attack, and they are only visible as they are retreating, as they are part of their defense mechanism. These SCPs are extremely strong and almost immune to all physical attacks. And although these SCPs are seemingly indestructible and able to escape most situations, their one true drawback is the fact that their hunting patterns are rather predictable. And if you have a strong enough light, you can cause them to retreat. With that being said, if you are targeted by this SCP, it will relentlessly follow you until you are dead, making this creature extremely terrifying. Moving on. SCP-973. This is one of the most interesting ones on the list, so definitely pay attention. This SCP is actually not 1, but 2 creatures in one. And I really can't even call them creatures. I don't even know what to call them, really. I know I've used the term creature a lot in this video, and if that's not accurate to SCP lore, I apologize, but that's just a term I'm comfortable with. Back to 973, The first part of this SCP is 973-1, which appears as a late 1970s police cruiser in very well-worn condition. SCP-973-1 has been reported to have a cracked windshield, dented bodywork, and even rust and scratches. Now, the second entity with this SCP is 973-2, which appears as a Caucasian police officer. He appears to be in his late 40s, and he, like the vehicle, is wearing a uniform that is similar to something that would be worn in the 1970s. Okay, cool. So this SCP is two entities and really just resembles a policeman in his car. So what? Well, this is where things get interesting. This SCP only inhabits a very specific stretch of US highway, and what it does is rather unusual. This SCP is most commonly triggered by, ironically enough, speeding, and when it does appear, it typically appears about a half a kilometer behind the victim's car. This SCP is seen with its lights on, accelerating behind the victim's vehicle at a very fast pace. Once the SCP is directly behind the victim's car, it is able to transfer a radio frequency to the victim's car, telling them to run. On the radio, they will hear the frequency say, "You better run." This mysterious and threatening message that comes over the radio has the same effect across all victims. They take the bait and they are encouraged to run away from the police. After only a few moments of the police chase going on, the SCP is able to catch up and overtake the vehicle, and the rest is pretty gruesome. The exact specifics are unknown, but the victim's vehicles are always found in a state of unimaginable damage, and the driver and passengers are much different. Bodies have been found mangled, abused, assaulted, and in some cases, mutilated beyond repair. There isn't a ton more known about this SCP, but I thought it was very scary because of how based in reality it was, and how you thought a simple police encounter, which is already in its own pretty scary, especially on a lonely stretch of road late at night, could be so much worse than you even imagined. Following that, we have SCP-939. 939 is a four-legged creature that travels in packs and has some very strange attributes. They have translucent red skin and sharp spines running down their back. They look almost like radiated wolves. As you could probably imagine, these creatures feed on human flesh, but that's not where things end. These creatures are proficient in voice mimicry and do so with scary accuracy. One of the scariest parts about it is that they can mimic voices that they've never been exposed to, and they can also hold very long, fluent conversations, leading the Foundation to believe that they are much more intelligent than what their appearance would suggest. Something rather unique about these creatures is the fact that they have no vital organs, and with that, no apparent need for food, suggesting that they are killing primarily out of sport. That's exactly where their voice mimicry comes to play. They use this ability to mimic the voices of a loved one who is distressed or in need of immediate help, drawing victims into unsafe places and leading to their demise. To me, this is very reminiscent of a Wendigo or a Skinwalker, and in my opinion, almost as scary too. But now it's time for the final entry of this list. We have SCP-682. SCP-682 is definitely one of the most iconic and, for me personally, one of the scariest SCPs that exists in the lore. And although it's not one of the strongest, it is very unique in its own way, and let's just get right into it. 682 is one of the most highly dreaded monsters by the Foundation, and for good reason. It is a highly intelligent reptile-like creature that, under all accounts, has proven to be impossible to kill. For me personally, that's definitely one of its most terrifying attributes. Like, the Foundation has literally tried everything to damage and destroy this creature to literally no avail, but let's keep going. This creature also possesses extremely high strength, speed, and reflexes. And worst of all, a hatred for all things living. If you ask me, that's an absolutely brutal combo, and that's why this creature is number one on the list. It literally hates everything that exists, it cannot be stopped or killed, and it is extremely strong and capable of crazy damage and obviously death. I could waffle on about this for a little bit longer, but I think you guys get the idea. For me, at least on this list, this creature takes the cake. And I guess everything else. But what do you guys think? Which creature was the scariest on this list in your opinion? And if you're familiar with SCPs, which one should I talk about next? Please let me know if you enjoyed this topic and also if you enjoyed my presentation of these creatures. I wanted to kind of take a surface level approach and really just focus on the creature itself and its unique attributes. Let me know, was it too basic or was it honestly really easy to digest? Please let me know what you guys think. I appreciate it so much. But for now, that's all from me.